All right, is this on? Yes. Welcome to Security Starts with Plain Language, or why do we need to think about how we communicate? My name is Håvard. I work as a platform developer in the municipality of Oslo. I'm really an infrastructure developer working with AWS, but I have developed a keen interest of UX and clear language while doing so. Because I believe that security failure can begin in the language that we actually use, not necessarily the programming language itself. So what I see is that the language that we use shape what we develop, and how we communicate with the code that we actually have. So I believe that, hello? Yeah, that works. We have to look at the language and security from 4 different perspectives. So we have to look at the intent, what's the purpose, the assumption, what is taken as a true, and this assumption can also exist within a context, and it's always important to be very aware of the context and what that actually implies. It deals with risk, how do we act on it, because a wording like medium risk really doesn't say much unless you have a clear understanding of what that means in the organization or the context that you are actually in. And it can mean something about the consequences of an incident can also be hidden if you use the language improperly. So this is very a complex thing, but luckily there are some things that we can use as a ground layer for dealing with this. Because, of course, there's an ISO standard for this, 24495 plain language that you use as a set of ground rules when it comes to communicating. So relevant, what does the user actually need? Avoid irrelevant information. Definability, how do you locate the information that you actually need? And how do you find the important things relevant to your task? The understandability, you have to write in a clear and concise language, but you need to understand your target audience. I will come back to this a little bit later as well. And the usability, it's not only about writing something to an end user, but you have to be able to read it in an easy way. This can come down to font and font size if you're actually doing documentation for an end user. Like our infrastructure documentation lives out there and is self-service, so you have to consider how you present your documentation to the end user as well. The next one is RFC 2119. Keywords for use in RFCs to indicate requirements level. If you've ever read an RFC, I guess a lot of people here have actually done that, you will see this sentence that says, the keywords must, recommended, and so on, must be interpreted as described in this RFC. So this RFC really puts forth how you should interpret the word recommended or must. And if you're going to implement TLS, for example, it's really important that we have the same understanding and the same feel about what must actually means. So if we have an example requirement that says users should be able to share documents with other users, depending on who you are, the seniority, if you are in working for the army or a social networking site, if you are a product lead, this will actually mean very many things. Because a single sentence, when it comes down to it, will hide a lot of security decisions, either by missing words, words that are assumed to be true, because the language actually shapes the intent of whoever writes it. So we have to be very careful about reviewing these things when we work with it. I use this requirement as an example, but this also applies to documents, your API nouns, if you do write an RFC, and any other things. So language shapes intent. So the word share can mean 2 widely different things depending on who you are and what context you are in. So we have to challenge the intent of any words and sentences used in order to get a secure implementation in the end. Because language shapes assumptions. So if a backend implementation says, okay, I'll share this document with a user ID and a doc ID, and since I do believe in sharing, I'll set the public to true. The front end will go ahead and click a create a button that says share. Both of these understand the word share, but they have two different meanings. So again, the language mustn't go unchecked if we're going to end up with something that is good. The language also shapes the perception of risk. So this comes down to how we as developers do git commits or change logs. So if the change log says added document sharing, it maybe should have said added the ability to create unauthenticated, non-expiring, public indexable links to any documents. That's two different things, because the last sentence there will actually trigger some mental models that will make you think about the context that you are currently standing in. The language also shapes the consequences. If a confidential file has been shared and a post-mortem actually can choose to focus on one or the other, and depending on the wording that you have, you will decide if the human or the machine should be fixed. So plain language, in my view, is a security control that we should implement on all levels, and we as developers should be more aware of what language actually communicate. So you understand the intent, you discover the assumptions, or maybe you acknowledge the actual risk, like how do you communicate risk in a Git log? And you can limit the consequences if you think about this from day one. Of course, this is NDC Security, and everybody talks about AI, and it's really interesting to look at plain language and UX when it comes to AI, because the development cycle has gone so quickly now compared to what it was just a few years ago. A few years ago, you had autocomplete in an IDE for a single sentence, and it was like, wow, this is magic. Now you instrument 8 agents in Claude, and it goes out and do something for you. So the development cycle is accelerated, and the instructions must be clear, and the human must be in the loop. This is why it's so important to look at the language that you use when you instruct the actual AI agent in terms of what it should do, because it will take that and execute on it. So this has to do with setting the context with clear boundaries. And personally, I took the ISO 24495 and I created a skill that I use inside Claude to help me out when either I will write documentation if there should be written error messages, API nouns, or anything text that actually needs to be understood quickly. I also took this and pointed it to our documentation. If you've ever written documentation, it becomes stale very, very quick. So I took this and I pointed it to our source code of our Terraform, and I pointed it to our our documentation. And this skill helped me identify a lot of places where we actually did wrong, and helped me clear out the language in terms of communicating the risk and the tasks that the user actually had to do when using our platform. In addition to this, we have also experimented with building laws of UX on top of this and doing other things in order to make sure that the AI agents get a clear and bound context. I am an infrastructure developer, but I want to end with a couple of tips that I think a lot of people coding should start reading. Laws of UX is a very interesting book in terms of some patterns, and there's a couple of Norwegian books, but how do you design with clear language, and how does clear language communicate the actual intent that you have? Thank you.